In 1945, World War II came to an end, leaving much of Europe in ruins and the global balance of power fundamentally altered. Two nations emerged from the conflict as dominant powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Though allied against Nazi Germany, their partnership had always been one of necessity rather than shared values, and with their common enemy defeated, the underlying tensions between them quickly surfaced. What followed was nearly 5 decades of ideological, political, and military rivalry known as the Cold War. Today, we'll examine how this conflict began, how it shaped the second half of the 20th century, and how it ultimately came to an end. At its core, the Cold War was a clash between two opposing systems. The United States represented capitalism and liberal democracy. The Soviet Union represented communism and one-party rule. These were not merely differing policy preferences. They were fundamentally incompatible visions for how society, government, and the economy should function. Once the shared threat of Nazi Germany was removed, each side viewed the expansion of the other system as a direct threat to its own security and way of life. The term Cold War reflects an important distinction. The United States and the Soviet Union never engaged in direct military combat with one another. Instead, the conflict was characterized by espionage, propaganda, economic competition, and support for opposing sides in third-party conflicts. This tension became apparent almost immediately after the war's end. Soviet forces occupied much of Eastern Europe and installed communist governments in countries, including Poland, Hungary, and East Germany. In response, Winston Churchill delivered his now famous 1946 speech warning that an Iron Curtain had descended across the continent, dividing the communist East from the democratic West. As Soviet influence expanded, the United States adopted a strategic doctrine known as containment, the principle that communism should not be rolled back where it already existed, but must be prevented from spreading further. This strategy took shape through several key initiatives. The Truman Doctrine, which committed the United States to supporting nations resisting communist expansion. The Marshall Plan, a large-scale economic recovery program for Western Europe. While framed as humanitarian assistance, it also served a clear strategic purpose. Economically stable nations were considered far less susceptible to communist influence. Two pivotal events in 1949 significantly escalated the conflict. First, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, ending the American monopoly on nuclear weapons. Second, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, won the Chinese Civil War, bringing the world's most populous nation into the communist sphere. What had begun as a bilateral rivalry was rapidly becoming a global struggle. By the early 1950s, much of the world had aligned with one of two opposing blocs. The Western powers formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949, a collective defense alliance in which an attack on one member would be treated as an attack on all. The Soviet Union responded in 1955 with the Warsaw Pact, its own military alliance with Eastern Bloc nations. This division gave rise to a defining feature of the Cold War, the proxy war. Rather than confronting one another directly, the United States and Soviet Union supported opposing sides in regional conflicts around the world. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, pitted communist North Korea, backed by the Soviet Union and China, against South Korea, supported by the United States and United Nations forces. The war ended in an armistice and a divided peninsula that persists to this day. The Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975, followed a similar pattern, with communist North Vietnam opposing the U.S.-backed South. The conflict lasted 2 decades and became one of the most contentious and consequential episodes of the era. While neither conflict involved direct combat between American and Soviet forces, both were widely understood as extensions of the broader Cold War rivalry. Perhaps the most consequential and dangerous dimension of the Cold War was the nuclear arms race. Both superpowers amassed vast nuclear arsenals, giving rise to a strategic doctrine known as mutually assured destruction (MAD). The premise was as stark as its acronym suggests. Any nuclear attack by one side would trigger a retaliatory strike from the other, guaranteeing the destruction of both. Paradoxically, this logic is credited with preventing nuclear conflict throughout the Cold War. The closest the world came to nuclear war occurred in October 1962. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, well within striking distance of the United States. For 13 tense days, the two nations stood on the brink of war before reaching a diplomatic resolution. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba, while the United States quietly agreed to remove its own missiles from Turkey. The crisis is widely regarded as the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War era. Cold War competition also extended into science and technology, most notably through the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth, catching the United States off guard and prompting significant investment in American science and technology education. The Soviets achieved several early milestones, including the first human spaceflight by Yuri Gagarin in 1961. The United States ultimately achieved the era's defining accomplishment in 1969, when Apollo 11 landed the first astronauts on the moon. Beyond its scientific significance, the achievement served as a powerful demonstration of American technological capability during an ongoing ideological competition. By the 1970s, both superpowers sought to ease hostilities, entering a period known as détente, marked by arms control agreements and improved diplomatic relations. This period of relative calm proved temporary. Tensions escalated again in the early 1980s, following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the election of U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who pursued a significant military buildup and adopted a more confrontational stance toward the Soviet Union. By this point, however, the Soviet Union faced mounting internal challenges. Decades of heavy military spending, combined with the structural inefficiencies of a centrally planned economy, had placed significant strain on the Soviet system. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Soviet Union and introduced two major reform initiatives: Glasnost, political openness, and Perestroika, economic restructuring. These reforms, intended to strengthen the Soviet system, instead accelerated its unraveling. The most symbolic moment of this collapse came in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The physical barrier that had divided East and West Berlin for nearly 3 decades was dismantled, triggering a rapid succession of revolutions across Eastern Europe as communist governments fell one after another. The Cold War formally concluded in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which fragmented into 15 independent states, including the Russian Federation. The Cold War spanned nearly 5 decades and, despite the absence of direct conflict between its two principal powers, shaped nearly every major global development of the latter 20th century, from regional wars fought by proxy, to a nuclear standoff that brought the world to the edge of catastrophe, to a race for technological supremacy that extended into space. Its legacy remains evident today, from the continued division of the Korean Peninsula to the structure of NATO and ongoing geopolitical tensions between the United States and Russia. Understanding the Cold War is essential not simply as a matter of historical record, but as a foundation for understanding much of the contemporary geopolitical landscape. Thank you.